Wounded Knee Massacre, December 29, 1890. Wounded Knee Creek, South Dakota. Around 350 Lakota men, women, and children were camped on the bank under U.S. Army escort. The night before, soldiers had surrounded the camp and positioned 4 Hotchkiss mountain guns on the surrounding hills, each capable of firing nearly 50 rounds per minute. The Lakota had been traveling to Pine Ridge Agency after weeks of tension over the Ghost Dance movement. The Army had decided the movement was a threat. At dawn, Colonel James W. Forsyth ordered the camp disarmed. Soldiers moved tent to tent. Most men handed over weapons without resistance. Then a deaf tribesman named Black Coyote raised his rifle above his head and refused to hand it over. He could not hear the soldiers shouting at him. He was explaining to the men beside him that he had paid for the rifle himself. A soldier moved to grab it. They struggled. Then, the rifle discharged into the air. The Hotchkiss guns on the hills opened fire simultaneously. Soldiers on the ground fired into the tents. Women grabbed children and ran for a ravine south of the camp. Soldiers followed them in and kept shooting. The Hotchkiss guns repositioned and fired into the ravine. Some Lakota were killed more than 2 miles from where it started. Between 250 and 300 Lakota were dead by the time it stopped. Most were women, children, and elderly. They were buried in a mass grave on January 3rd. 25 soldiers died, the majority from friendly fire. Colonel Forsyth was charged with misconduct. The charges were dropped. 20 of his soldiers received the Medal of Honor. Connor's Winter Assault. January 29, 1863. Bear River, present-day Idaho. Colonel Patrick Connor moved 200 soldiers of the California Volunteers into position around the winter camp of the northwestern band of the Shoshone Nation before sunrise. Around 450 Shoshone, men, women, and children, were sheltering there. The temperature was below zero. Connor placed cavalry at the river crossing to the north to cut off escape. Then he sent infantry in from the south at first light. The Shoshone held ground initially, using natural ravines for cover. Connor swung the cavalry around to complete the encirclement. The first rifle crack split the frozen air at 6 a.m. Warriors fell in the ravines where they had taken cover. Then the soldiers moved through the camp itself. A woman running with a child was shot at the water's edge. Bodies entered the current and did not come back up. The shooting continued for 4 hours. When it stopped, at least 350 Shoshone were dead. Connor reported 224. Historians have since put the number higher. Around 160 women and children were taken prisoner. His men destroyed the winter food stores. They took 175 horses. Then they left the bodies on the frozen ground. Wolves reached the site within days. It is the deadliest single massacre of Native Americans in U.S. history. The ground where it happened is quiet now. There is no national monument. Black Kettle's Camp. November 29, 1864. Sand Creek, Colorado Territory. Chief Black Kettle's Cheyenne and Arapaho encampment of roughly 700 people had been told by U.S. Army officials they were under military protection. Black Kettle had raised an American flag and a white surrender flag above his lodge as instructed. Colonel John Chivington arrived before dawn with 700 troops and howitzers. The night before, he had reportedly told his officers to kill and scalp all, regardless of age. He was aware the camp was protected. At first light, soldiers charged from multiple directions. Black Kettle stood in the open holding the American flag up. The shooting did not stop. Testimony later given to Congress confirmed most of the dead were women, children, and the elderly. The men were out hunting. Between 150 and 200, Cheyenne and Arapaho were killed. After the killing, soldiers mutilated the bodies. Scalps and severed body parts were taken as souvenirs. When the unit returned to Denver, those trophies were displayed on stage at a theater between acts. The audience cheered. Chivington was never court-martialed. He resigned before charges could reach him. He spent the rest of his life calling it a victory. The Forced March West. Autumn 1838, Georgia, Tennessee, Alabama, North Carolina. The Cherokee Nation had spent years fighting removal through American courts. They were literate. They had their own newspaper, a written constitution. They had formally adopted legal frameworks the United States recognized. They took their case to the Supreme Court and won. President Andrew Jackson refused to enforce the ruling and ordered removal to proceed. On a morning in September, soldiers reached a farmhouse in northern Georgia. A family was eating breakfast. The soldiers ordered them outside. The family was given no time to gather food or tools. They were walked to a stockade camp and put inside. Across Cherokee territory that month, the same thing happened at door after door. Around 16,000 people were held through summer in stockade camps. Measles spread, dysentery spread, whooping cough spread. All inside overcrowded enclosures before the march began. The route west covered roughly 1,200 miles through autumn and deep into winter. A government contractor had been awarded the supply contract and quietly cut provisions to widen his margin. There were not enough blankets. Food ran short weeks in. People died walking. Children died in their parents' arms. Elders who fell were left on the road. Approximately 4,000 Cherokee died before the survivors reached Indian Territory in the spring of 1839. That figure represents roughly 1 in 4 people who began the march. The Cherokee named it Nunadaltsuni, Highlands Clan Killings. November 5, 2019. Karita Village, Hela Province, Papua New Guinea. Armed men arrived from a rival clan before most of the village was awake. What followed was not a confrontation. It was a methodical killing operation that ran for several hours. At least 24 people were dead by the time it ended. Pregnant women, children. Bodies were found inside homes, in the surrounding bush, and along the paths people had tried to escape on. Some were hacked with bush knives. Others were shot. Several houses burned. The attack was the latest episode in a land dispute between clans in the Hela Highlands. The grievances are old. The weapons are not. Modern firearms had entered communities that had previously fought with bows and axes. No one was convicted. In 2023, the violence continued. On February 18, 2024, gunmen surrounded sleeping villagers in Enga province before dawn and killed at least 26 people. Officials confirmed the attack was PRE planned. The victims were unarmed. Hela and Enga provinces sit within a region where tribal warfare has killed thousands over 3 decades. Amazon River Ambush. June 5, 2022. Vale do Javari, Brazilian Amazon. British journalist Dom Phillips, age 57, and Brazilian indigenous specialist Bruno Pereira, age 41, set out by boat on the Itui River toward Atalaia do Norte. Phillips was writing a book on saving the Amazon. Pereira had spent years running surveillance operations against illegal fishing networks in indigenous territory. He had been receiving threats for weeks. The night before they left, a man named Amarildo da Costa de Oliveira, known locally as Pilado, overheard Pereira ask Phillips to photograph him. Pilado ran an illegal fishing operation in the same territory. He read the photo as documentation that would be used to identify and prosecute him. He contacted a man named Jefferson da Silva Lima. Pilado and da Silva intercepted the boat on the river the following morning. Then, they opened fire. Both men were killed. The bodies went into the water. Pilado spent the following days cremating the remains to remove evidence. He confessed on June 15. Remains were recovered on June 22. The investigation uncovered an organized criminal network running illegal fishing, drug trafficking, and land invasion throughout the Vale do Javari. Phillips and Pereira were not killed out of panic. They were killed to protect a supply chain. The smallpox steamboat. Spring 1837. The steamboat. St. Peter's pushed up the Missouri River toward Fort Clark in present-day North Dakota. On board were trade goods, passengers, and smallpox. The American Fur Company had been warned before departure that the ship carried infection. A quarantine was possible. The company sent it upriver anyway. In late June, Mandan traders boarded the boat. They handled blankets and supplies. They carried them back to the Earth Lodge village beside the fort. Days later, the first fevers began. A child developed a rash, then another. Blisters spread across faces and arms. People struggled to breathe. The sick lay on buffalo robes inside crowded lodges while family members tried to cool them with water from the river. Within weeks, entire households were infected. The dead lay where they fell. There were not enough healthy people to dig graves. Bodies were carried outside and placed in rows along the village edge. The smell spread across the settlement. Some survivors fled into the hills. Others refused food and waited to die. Chief Four Bears had traded with Americans for 20 years. He fell ill in July. On July 30, 1837, he died inside the village he had defended. Before his death, he accused the traders at the fort of bringing deliberate destruction. Before the outbreak, the Mandan numbered around 1,600 people across 2 villages. By the end of the summer, fewer than 150 remained alive. The virus did not stop there. It moved to the Hidatsa, then the Arikara. Ceremonial leaders died. Families vanished. Entire lineages ended in a single season. The social structure of 3 nations collapsed within months.